Hello and welcome everyone. I hope you all enjoyed the film and thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Jasmine Eppelsheimer and I'll be moderating the panel and the Q&A tonight. I'm so pleased to moderate as a member of this team in a community outreach role. I've been on the outreach team for a few years now and I've carried this project through various phases. It's been a great project to be part of. Each time I see this film, I feel hopeful, which is a rare feeling nowadays, but I'm reminded of the deeply important work of these abortion providers who are there for us every day and whose commitment to activism is being expressed in the film itself. Our team would like to give a shout out and a thank you to Portland State University for hosting this event and to the Portland State University Foundation, as well as the psychology department at Portland State for their support of this project over the years. We also want to thank producer David Kress and associate producers Marsha Walsh and Christine Farrington for their faithfulness to the vision of this project. Donations to this event will go to the National Network of Abortion Funds, a vital organization providing support and resources for people facing barriers in access to abortion. So before we continue, I would like to do a land acknowledgement, which has become an important way of opening meetings to acknowledge the ground that we're on here in Portland. We acknowledge the land on which we sit and which we occupy at Portland State University. The Portland metro area rests on traditional village sites in the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Claflin, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapua, Malala, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River, creating communities and summer encampments to harvest and use the plentiful natural resources of the area. We take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land. Throughout this whole session, please submit any questions you have for the featured providers or Director Jan Haaken by clicking the Q&A button below the on-screen video. After the panel, we'll begin by answering as many questions as we can. We are also accepting questions through Instagram and Facebook, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as time allows. So, we are so honored to have some of the lead subjects in this film with us for this panel discussion to share their experience of the film and their insights on the upcoming political terrain. We're going to hear from the panelists for about 45 minutes, and then we will open it up to all of you attending and who have submitted questions. I will let them introduce themselves and what they hope people get from this film. So we'll start with Director Jan Haaken. And Jan, I'd also like to ask you if you could share how this project got started. I'm sure viewers would be interested in hearing more about that. So when you're ready.
Well, it's an important milestone this evening to be part of an event that also launches the film as it's available on video on demand. That film actually started with a team of researchers called Providers Share at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, a team led by Lisa Harris and Jane Hassinger through Women's Studies in the Department of OBGYN there. And they had been interviewing, carrying out research and community work with providers around the world on their experiences with abortion stigma and how they confronted it, how they dealt with it in their communities. So about 4 years ago, the team brought me onto their project to carry their findings into the medium of a documentary film. And I did 2 short films for them, directed 2 shorts, one called Being There and another set in Kenya called Kwepo. And in the course of showing those films to my students and at some festivals, I was struck by how little even my students and many activists in the pro-choice community knew about abortion. Mm-hmm. And we all knew that the anti-choice movement had dominated visual culture, and the aim was to, in the short films, was to reclaim visual culture and to kind of pull back the curtain on abortion care. But after those 2 short films, I was really inspired and intrigued by people who do this work and thought there was a bigger story to be told. There are a number of really good films, documentaries on difficulties in access, the barriers women face, particularly in minority or marginalized communities, to access abortion care, but very little on the people who do the work itself. and how they confront stigma, their ethical commitments, and how they train younger professionals coming into the field to do this work. And I felt there was a lot to learn from them, not only about abortion care, but a kind of a vision of healthcare as well. So we pursued this path with a lot of support from many people, some of whom are hopefully with us this evening on this feature film, to tell a bigger story, and to take up some of the more difficult questions and issues that I think have been avoided in much of the pro-choice community, reclaiming the emotional complexity of the work and areas of ambivalence people have about abortion, and how providers themselves confront those questions in the course of being there every day, being there for women in their communities.
Yeah. Thank you, Jan. So now let's hear from some of our featured doctors. Again, please, if you could introduce yourself, a little bit about what you hope people get from this film, and if you could share a bit about your experience being in the film. Dr. Andrea Shiverini, would you start us off?
Sure. Hi. My name's Andrea Shiverini. I live in Portland, Oregon, which is pretty famous right now. I was part of the original Being There short film because of my work with at Downtown Women's Center, which is was a nonprofit, all women run feminist model abortion clinic that has been in the downtown Portland area for, well, over 30 years. And I had worked there since I came back to Portland after my residency training. And Jan came in to use that site as one of her primary places for filming the short film. And I was asked if I wanted to participate or was willing to participate. And I had never really been in that kind of thing before, sort of kind of a lay low kind of person. And I thought about it and decided, why not? So that sort of started a whole big ball that has continued to roll and has been really interesting. I've learned a lot myself from this process, and when Being There came out, and then Jan had the idea that she wanted to tell a bigger story, we brainstormed about it, and I was really, honored that she had this idea of wanting to show the reality of what abortion providers do from a perspective that really has been lacking in the visual culture. And I really appreciated that she had that vision. So I, of course, was happy to work with her on that. In terms of what people will get out of it, I think everybody's going to obviously come at it from different places. And I hope that this film can reach people who don't necessarily go into it with a set opinion. There's a lot of people in our country who have ambivalence, like Jan said, and some people have very solid opinions about abortion, and some people don't. And I would hope that this film can educate, because that was originally one of Jan's biggest goals, because she has been primarily an educator, and it kind of makes sense that she moved into documentary filmmaking, because part of it is, the purpose is to educate. And so I hope that even if it doesn't necessarily change someone's mind about how they personally feel about abortion, my hope is that it can educate people so that they understand more about the science of it and the reality of it, and so there's not a myth as much around it. And the more firsthand information people have that's real instead of fake and posed, I think that people can formulate more accurate opinions rather than based on things like I think it's talked about in the film, the like the Planned Parenthood
Mm-hmm.
fake videos that were made as one example.
Yeah.
So that's sort of my biggest thing that I hope people will see.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Dr. Mark Nichols, could you go next?
Sure, my pleasure. Thank you for everyone for organizing this event. I'm excited to share the thoughts of this group and hope that it will sort of add some complexity to the viewing of the film. I would echo a little bit of what Andrea was saying in terms of what I would hope people would get from this, from watching this film. I think historically abortion providers have been viewed as having a very narrow niche and somewhat of a fringe engagement with healthcare, not really in the mainstream. And I think this film really demonstrates that for most all of us in this film, abortion care is an important part of the work we do, but it's just one part, and we do lots of other kinds of healthcare, and that was, I think that's very clearly demonstrated. I also hope that this film will inspire people to be involved in abortion care in some fashion, not just providers, but people who want to volunteer or to serve as support people in clinics, or just be supportive of friends who are going through it and can have a different kind of conversation from seeing what happens as abortion is being provided. That's so I hope there's some inspiration that comes out of this. So my involvement in the film was from the very beginning. Jan mentioned Lisa Harris at University of Michigan as kind of the nexus of this project. And Lisa called me and said, would you mind calling somebody at Portland State University and who's a filmmaker and wants to make a film? And boy, I don't remember exactly when that was, Jan. It was a long time ago now, but that was sort of the conception, I'd say. And we finally arrived at labor and delivery and are about to give birth to a beautiful film that will really, I think, change the conversation about abortion care. My own personal involvement, I really haven't done anything like this, so it was a little unusual helping Jan choreograph filming in clinics and in labor and delivery and all sorts of challenges that I had no idea about. I also found it very interesting to see myself on film. I really haven't done that very much. And yeah, we'll just leave it at that. It was not exactly what I expected, but it was fun. I learned a ton, and I just want to say thank you, Jan, for making this film and pushing through a lot of challenges to get it produced. And I just think you deserve a tremendous amount of credit for producing something that's really beautiful and powerful. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nichols. Next, could we hear from Dr. Deb Oyer?
So hi, I am a family medicine physician by training. I do mostly reproductive health care. And it really was a joy to be part of this film. I got a call from Jan, who was looking for a clinic that might allow her to film. And it was shocking to me how many of our patients said, sure, come on in. I'm fine having you film as long as you don't show who I am. I think the film, it's hard coming third on this because I think Andrea and Mark spoke a lot to what we hope people will get out of the film. But for me, sort of the three things that came to mind were reality of what really happens during an abortion and what people go through, both from the patient side and the provider side, to end up where they need to be. I think the normalization of abortion is part of healthcare, and the normalization of providers who provide, as Mark said, it's part of what we do. And for me, it's been a huge part of what I do for my whole career. And I think I find such joy in my job and what I do, and how it helps people move on in their lives as they need to. And I want people to understand that, because so often patients will ask, oh, you must hate your job. And in fact, I love my job, and I want people to know that. And then a little self-serving, what I want people to get is the dedication of abortion providers. And, as you watch Andrea go to the airport yet again, you see the kind of dedication that really all of us have for the work that we do. In addition, I would just say the experience in being in the film was really fun. Jan was great at getting people to talk about themselves and the work and what we do. And if she didn't like what we said, she would ask yet another probing question off screen, and did really a great job of getting us to speak from our hearts, and then putting it all together in what I think was a fabulous film. So thanks.
Thank you. That leaves Dr. Sarah Prager.
Hi, yes. I'm Sarah Prager. I'm an OBGYN in the Seattle area, and I work at the University of Washington, and I do abortions and I teach abortions. And my motivation for being in the film was severalfold. I think one was really an opportunity to participate in a project like this with my mentors, people that I've looked up to for a long time. Dr. Mark Nichols, Dr. Deb Oyer have been mentors for me for a very long time. Dr. Oyer taught me how to do abortions a very long time ago now. And so the ability to be in film about our work together was really, really special to me. And then I think Jan's focus on education and, as been mentioned, training abortion providers is also really meaningful because it's not talked about or shown much. And so to be able to include a conversation with medical students and to show training with other fellows or residents was, I think, really important to show how dedicated people are, not just to providing exceptional care to patients, but also to ensuring that the next generation of providers is also being created with compassion and empathy and skill. So I, also thank Jan for choosing this focus, because I think it is kind of a different focus. And, as has been mentioned, abortion is in the public eye in a lot of ways, oftentimes in a very negative way. And so for me anyway, I think this shows abortion in a very positive light, both the act of getting an abortion, the people who are getting abortions, and the providers who are providing that care, and having that these positive images of abortion care, I think, is really important, and we need more of them to counteract a lot of the negative speak that's out there as well. So I'm hoping that those are really the messages that the audience will also get from the film.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for sharing with us a little bit what this documentary has meant to you. Just a quick reminder to viewers to submit any questions you all have if you haven't done so already, and let us know if you have a specific question for someone on the panel. So I do have a question I'd like to pose to the panelists just to get us started. So in the film, we see how how a woman's different identities like race, class, and geographical location impact their rights and access to reproductive health care. I'd be curious to hear your take on how COVID-19 has exacerbated the disparities for low-income women, rural and undocumented women who are disproportionately women of color and their access to reproductive services. Who would like to kind of take that on?
I'm happy to start.
Great.
I think, as often is the case, where you live, besides all of the things you mentioned, makes a huge difference in one's access. And many of the red states, the politicians used COVID-19 as a way to put even more limits on abortion than they have in their states already. In our state, in Washington state, our governor, when he pulled things back in March and said no non-essential healthcare can happen, he said very clearly family planning, including abortion, is essential healthcare. Whereas in the red states, many of the governors very quickly called out and said abortion is not essential healthcare and cannot happen. And so there had to be a lot of court cases and delays in order for people to continue to get abortions. And so I think that has been a huge problem. And again, in those states, everywhere, people have been losing their jobs and not having enough money for housing, et cetera. And then in those states, there's also not Medicaid funding for abortion. And so people who need them and live in those states have lost their jobs, their ability to get an abortion. And then when they finally can get one, they don't have the money to pay for it. So I think that's sort of just very quick and clear of one of the things that COVID-19 has caused.
Mm-hmm. Is there anyone else to speak?
If I could just emphasize that, I would say abortion care for a long time has been kind of relegated in some ways to the haves and the have-nots, and those who have can get one, and those who have not have a much harder time getting an abortion. I think COVID has made everything more stark between the haves and the have-nots, and abortion care is one more example of how people who have difficulty accessing food, water, housing, healthcare, jobs, etc., abortion is also going to be more out of their reach in the time of COVID than with COVID not being a factor.
Yeah, this is Mark. I might add to that as well. The film looks at this issue in a really effective way, I thought, and that was helpful. And to Sarah's point and Deb's point, it's just gotten worse with this current infection. I didn't mention in the beginning, but I'm in Portland also at the OHSU and provide abortions there and at Planned Parenthood. And we've seen patients coming in from Louisiana, from Texas. And of course, who are these folks? These are people who have the means to be able to travel that distance. And of course, the folks who have the least ability to pay for the travel and stay overnight, et cetera, are the ones who won't be able to get care. So it's just exacerbated an already terrible problem. It's very frustrating.
So I wanted to add a few thoughts about how the film was influenced by our understandings of racism as it relates to access to abortion and reproductive health services. Yeah, for many of us from the very beginning, it was important to acknowledge the contributions of Black feminists to the abortion rights movement, the importance of the concept of reproductive justice, that choice has to be understood in the context of constraints on women's lives, and the choice to raise children, to raise them in a healthy way, as well as not to carry a pregnancy they don't choose to continue with. And so I think that's been really important for many of us to honor and recognize the contributions of of Black feminism to this movement and expanding the framework beyond pro-choice or access to abortion to this broader concept of reproductive justice and healthcare as a basic human right.
Thanks, Jan. It looks like we have time for a few brief responses before moving on to the question and answer part of our program. I don't know if anyone else wants to just take a minute to wrap up some final thoughts on this topic, or I could pose another question really quick too. Okay, so I'll pose one last question before we move on. I think this is interesting. The film brings up the growing control of the Catholic Church that it has over hospitals and the procedures doctors can provide regarding women's health. I don't know if anyone wants to speak a little bit more about this issue. I don't think a lot of our viewers are familiar with these restrictions, which are prevalent in even more progressive states like Washington and Oregon.
I'm happy to speak to that first, if that's okay. This is increasingly a really, really important issue across the country, but most especially actually in Washington State. In Washington State, 45% of hospital beds are under the control of the Catholic Church. And that's a statistic that I think shocks people when they hear about it, because we think of Washington in general as being very liberal. And it's hard to translate that to then understanding that a lot of reproductive health care can be limited simply by being administered within a Catholic facility. And there's a lot of confusion created, as I talk about in the film a little bit, because not all Catholic institutions interpret the ethical and religious directives in the same way. So there's a lack of conformity as to what exactly those limits to healthcare are. And providers often don't know what they can and can't do. Patients certainly don't know what they can and can't access at those sites. And the last thing that somebody is doing, let's say when they have an ectopic pregnancy, is thinking about, well, let me think, can I go to that emergency room, or am I not going to get good care because it's actually owned by a Catholic institution, and so they might not treat ectopic pregnancy in an evidence-based way. So certainly that wouldn't be what I was thinking. But most people don't even know to consider that when they're getting healthcare. It's often not 100% clear either whether an institution is under the auspices of a Catholic church or not, because there are so many mergers that are happening. And that happens all the time, where an institution that is not Catholic will merge with an institution that is, but not change its name. So you can't always tell now whether or not an institution is controlled by a Catholic, whether or not a hospital is controlled by a Catholic institution just by the name. And it used to be a little bit easier, like Saint Anything was basically a Catholic healthcare system, but now that's not always a dead giveaway. So this becomes really a challenge.
So Deb, I was wondering if you could also speak to that. Many people are confused by the distinction between abortion as a very simple procedure. Most of them are performed in outpatient clinics safely, but then under some conditions, people need to be in a hospital. And you address that in the film, which can be, I think, confusing if people don't understand the nuances of that.
Yeah, sometimes, so for the most part, abortion is a very safe, common procedure. And sometimes people, because of their own healthcare issues, need to have their procedure in the hospital just for better monitoring, or because certain complications would be more likely. And so when a hospital becomes a Catholic hospital, we often lose the ability to have an inpatient procedure in that hospital. So for example, if someone has very severe asthma and their lungs aren't in prime shape, it might be helpful to have them have their abortion in a hospital. People who have complications. Sometimes people don't often know this, but having many C-sections prior to having an abortion can cause some issues with the uterus, where bleeding complications can be more common, and therefore doing the procedure in the hospital just so there's better monitoring, more blood products available. And so in Seattle, when one of our big hospital systems became Catholic, what we lost was the ability to do the occasional inpatient procedure there. And in fact, just this past week or two, one more hospital in Seattle became a Catholic hospital. So Sarah, I believe your 49%, 45% was low prior to that merger. So I think we're probably now up over 50% of hospital beds in Washington are Catholic.
Thank you,
I would
Dr.
add, sorry, Jasmine, I would add another layer to that, and that is that even in the teaching environment where residents and medical students are being taught about abortions, oftentimes hospital policy will limit the amount or the kind of abortion care that can be provided. There was a survey that just came out this month that looked at the gestational age of the state law where various teaching hospitals were located. And it turned out, and don't hold me to this number, but I believe it was about 45% of the hospitals were not able to go up to the state law gestational age limit, which really limits the kind of care that the providers there would be able to provide. So why would that be? Why wouldn't you be able to go right up to the state gestational age limit? Well, there are always politics in any big institution, and hospitals certainly fall into that category. So likely there were pressures that prohibited the providers who would have wanted to go to a higher gestational age from being able to do so. So it's a multi-layered, complicated issue around access to particularly the kinds of cases we're talking about in hospital that are often, for patients who really need expert care and are more challenging.
I would add one more thing, which is just with the Catholic healthcare system issue, that many women find themselves in situations where the community they live in, that is the only hospital. So the situation is pretty dire in Seattle, but if you get outside of the city and you get into rural Washington, actually primarily practice in Washington now, Washington State, but I live in Oregon. But in both Oregon and Washington, in the rural areas, sometimes that's the only hospital in town is a Catholic hospital. So in speaking about what Dr. Prager was saying about having an ectopic pregnancy or a miscarriage that's in process, you may not have an option and just go to the only hospital that's within 100 miles, and that's all you have, and it's a Catholic hospital. And then add to that maybe your employer has one insurance to offer you, and that insurance is a Catholic health system insurance. So it's, again, more of those layers like Mark is talking about.
Thank you. So we have some really good questions coming in right now. So I'll pose some of these for the providers. One question that just came in, institutionalized racism, past and present, is a barrier to healthcare. What are maybe some methods to increase access to contraception and abortion care for minority communities?
Sarah, do you want to say something about the Hyde Amendment and Medicare, Medicaid and Medicare for all?
Sure. So almost as soon as Roe v. Wade was passed, there was also passed other legislation to limit the extent of abortion access. And the Hyde Amendment is a really great first example of that. This is an amendment that was passed in Congress and essentially renewed annually or with each session to disallow any abortion happening using Medicare dollars or federal Medicaid dollars, with very rare exceptions. And this was put into place very deliberately, and we have recorded words from Hyde. I believe he was a representative at the time, but don't quote me on that. Might have been a senator. Speaking very clearly that the reason he wanted to have this amendment created was to limit access specifically for Black people. So they prettied it up in other words, but at the base, this was racist legislation. And this legislation exists still. It is still on the books. And there are increasing efforts to eliminate the Hyde Amendment, which is not going to happen with our current Senate. But if we again have Democratic control of the House and Senate, then it's certainly possible that we could do away with that amendment at some point. And then this would be really significant, as was mentioned before, in terms of limitations for people during COVID or just in general. For instance, in Washington State, we can use state Medicaid dollars to pay for abortion. And that is life-changing. It really increases access for so many people. And in so many states where Medicaid cannot be used to pay for abortion, the majority of states, Medicaid cannot be used to pay for abortion. That means that people who don't have financial means have to struggle a lot more to raise the money to get their abortion. And that often means that they can't access their abortion until later in a gestation, which makes it A, more expensive, B, as the gestational age increases, the risk to the woman also, or to the person actually increases a little bit too. And so creates all of these additional barriers that are meant to just reinforce racial profiling and decrease access for mostly Black people, but also other people of color in our country. I mean, in terms of what we could do to fix that, it would be eliminate the Hyde Amendment, make Medicaid and Medicare funding available across the country for people who need abortion care. And, we could go one step further and just say a little bit of socialized medicine goes a long way. And that would really help people at all. If we considered abortion to be just a regular part of healthcare, which it is, and it's healthcare that's accessed by more than 1 in every 4 women during their reproductive lifespan. This is not exceptional care, and we need to stop exceptionalizing it.
Thank you.
Can I just add about contraception on that? The Affordable Care Act really changed people's access to contraceptive coverage nationally if they could afford health care. In health insurance. So it still left many people uninsured, but at least those that were insured, aside from some small exceptions, their contraception had to be covered, or still does for the moment, has to be covered with no copay. And that has changed things. We see at our clinic just astronomically. People come in and they can have the birth control they want as opposed to the one they can afford. And so as Sarah said, if we could expand that both to abortion, but also for everyone, whether you have a job that pays for your health insurance or whether you have money to pay in for health insurance or not, that would help significantly.
Thank you. So another question that came in that I think Dr. Nichols might be able to speak to. Are there concerns that there will not be enough abortion providers in the future or enough younger providers getting trained?
Well, thank you for asking that question. And Sarah is probably more qualified to answer that, but I'll go first since you gave me the mic. I've been involved in abortion training for a very long time. It's been a central part of my career and have really, really enjoyed that. And you know, we, all the panelists are, you know, in Washington and Oregon, and these are places where we've been training medical students and residents and fellows in abortion care for a long time. You know, I have a current example that I'm dealing with right now. I'm traveling to Montana to provide abortions there because the one second trimester abortion provider in Billings, Montana, unfortunately died recently, and there was no one there, nobody to step up and take over that care. Whereas if I, for some reason, wasn't able to provide abortions in Portland, Oregon, there are 100 people who could step in and take over for me. So it's a very different part of, based on the part of the country that you're in, it's highly variable. If I may just jump to, I'm seeing in the Q&A, there are questions about nurse practitioners and other non-physicians and in terms of training. And there's, happily, we're really starting to see more and more of that. Again, the West Coast has been pretty active in training nurse practitioners. I personally have trained many, and they are providing abortions all over Oregon, which is very, very satisfying. That is going to be based on state law, and there are several groups of lawyers who are fighting those laws prohibiting nurse practitioners from being able to provide abortions. And that would, if we can turn back some of those laws and allow these highly trained, very skilled providers to do a very simple procedure, it would greatly increase access. So, so those are things that I hope will continue to make some progress on. And yeah, so it's been a great part of my career to do that training.
Thank you. We do.
Sorry, I was going to just follow up on that and say, you know, it doesn't take an OBGYN to do an abortion. It doesn't take a physician to do an abortion. It takes a well-trained clinician. And that clinician can be a physician. That clinician can be an advanced practice clinician. And if you look around the world, the majority of abortions are actually not provided by physicians. They're provided by nurses, nurse midwives, some form of advanced practice clinician. So the more we can make legal the broader groups of people who can be well trained to provide this service, the more access that there will be. And that's actually another way to reduce structural barriers to abortion care across the country.
Can I add something to that around the title of the film itself? And that sometimes comes up as a question, our bodies are doctors. Why the focus on doctors? In that there are many providers who are essential to this care. And my first career was as a nurse, and I worked in Feminist Women's Health Center in LA, and was assisted with abortion care there, and became very interested in the feminist clinic movement. And even the word provider, the term provider encompasses all of the people who provide this care, whether you're a receptionist, a nurse, an assistant, as well as a doctor. And that was really important to us on the team from the outset, that the group support aspect and a feminist vision of healthcare is not the doctors in charge and telling everybody else what to do, but a more democratic ethos of healthcare that's part of the feminist model. But it's also the case that doctors have been the most demonized and targeted by the anti-choice movement. And so it felt important to focus on the doctors because they have been the most targeted. But at the same time, we wanted to emphasize a kind of feminist vision or model of healthcare where doctors are part of a team, and it takes a group to do this work.
Thank you. So we do have a question specifically for Dr. Andrea Shiverini. The question is, you mentioned growing up in the South and moving to Oregon after residency. I'm curious if where you did your residency impacted where you wanted to provide abortion services. Why not go back to live/work in the South?
So my story is that I actually moved to Portland when I was 20, and I had dropped out of college, and I started volunteering at the Feminist Women's Health Center in Portland, more as a just political reasons, and I had no idea that I wanted to work in healthcare as a career. I was a French and theater major, and I just thought I would be answering phones and filing papers. And first time I showed up, they put me in aftercare and they gave me a bunch of stuff to read and said, you're going to talk to women about what they can expect after their abortion and talk to them about contraception. And I was like, I guess I got some stuff to learn. And so I quickly found that I loved doing the work, and they trained me to do everything. I learned how to do ultrasounds, and process sterile equipment, and I remember they made us watch an abortion, because if you wanted to work there, you had to see everything that was happening there. And I was 20 years old, and I'd never seen a medical procedure in my life, and I stood there and I watched the abortion, and I thought, and I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian family. Abortion was wrong and everything. And I stood there and I watched it happen, and I thought, this doesn't bother me. And I thought, I think that since this doesn't bother me, I probably should do this work. Like, I felt like an obligation. I thought, well, there's a lot of people who are bothered by this. They're pro-choice, but they can't physically do it. And I thought, yeah, I should do this. And so I went to medical school. So all of my training, I went back to college in Portland. I actually went to Portland State, where Jan was a professor.
Why were none of the patients getting abortions interviewed in the film? Was it because they didn't want to be, or was it a deliberate choice you made as a director?
Well, every documentary or film, for that matter, has a point of view and follows protagonists, and we see the world through their eyes. And as I said in the beginning, there are a number of films that are from the point of view of women seeking access and the obstacles they face. But when we approached women in clinics that had supported the project, we presented this as a film about the providers in the clinic, particularly the doctors who do this work, and that the film came about as a way of showing more of their story. That the film would not identify them, but that it would be showing their procedures. So that was something that was kind of surprising and quite moving to those of us on the crew, because, we had sometimes 2 cameras, a whole crew in the room where there's a procedure going on, but that there were maybe 9 or 10 women who agreed out of their own way of expressing their appreciation to their providers to be there for them. And I think a little known aspect of what are called HIPAA rules, they're guidelines you have to follow when you film or a media in a medical facility, that there are rights of privacy that are very important to adhere to. I've worked in medical centers, so I was familiar with HIPAA rules, but people also under HIPAA rules have the right to speak, to tell their story to the media. They have the right to participate in a media story, as well as the right to privacy. They also have to be reassured that their choice will not affect their care. So it has to be done in a very respectful way, where they're given the opportunity, but also understood that, whether they decide to participate or not will not affect their care. But this, and even with the birth scene in the film, the woman who gave birth was told that this is a film about abortion providers. So she understood when she signed and gave consent to have her birth filmed, because we wanted to show kind of the continuum of the reproductive life of places in the continuum of reproductive health care to include a birth scene. And she agreed to have her birth filmed to support, in this sense, educating the public on abortion care.
Thank you. We have another question too. What is the average cost of an abortion should a family not have access to insurance coverage?
It depends completely on where she lives and how far pregnant the person is. So at our clinic, the Cedar River clinics, if you are 12 weeks or less, which is the vast majority of abortions, it's about $625. But it can go up to several $1,000s if you're at the other end of our scale, which is 26 weeks. So it varies greatly. And I think each of us who work in different sites would have different prices.
Thank you. We have another question for Dr. Prager.
Can I just make a really quick point about that? I would like to just point out that if one were to look at, since the 70s and 80s, the cost of abortion care, outpatient abortion care, has barely increased, and definitely has not increased in proportion to other medical costs, definitely not in proportion to inflation. And Mark talks in the film about, how abortion has been kind of on the sidelines of medicine and been in independent clinics. And in some senses, that's been a negative because it's made us more targets. But at the same time, there have been positives of that. And one of the positives is that has allowed people to keep the costs down, particularly in those cases, in many cases, such as states where everyone has to pay out of pocket, so that it is, even though access is limited in a lot of ways, it's at least more accessible because the cost has been kept down. And that's been a very deliberate thing for within the movement. And we do have these great funds that help to cover costs, not only with the procedure itself, but also travel costs, or for women that have a 2-day procedure, having to stay overnight, things like that, because there's a lot of hidden costs to acquiring an abortion. But I just wanted to make the point that compared to many other healthcare procedures, there's, again, the narrative has always been, not always been, but for many people, the narrative is there's these doctors and they're getting rich off of, doing abortions, and I can attest, having worked in many different clinics and trained in many different clinics, that is not the case, that it really is, the goal is to get people in and be able to get them access to care. There are for-profit and nonprofit clinics, and that's the way medicine is in general in this country. But overall, it's a very affordable thing compared to most healthcare.
Thank you. So for Dr. Prager, for institutions who are under the control of the church and have restrictions due to it, is there an effective way to fight back?
Wow, that's a great question. There are some ways to fight back. It's unclear whether or not they're effective. I mean, I would like to say vote with your business. But unfortunately, as was pointed out by Dr. Shivarini, that's not always possible if you want to get healthcare within 100 or even sometimes 200 or 300 or 500 miles of your own home. There are certainly parts of the country where only Catholic institutions can be accessed within huge distances from where somebody lives. So it's, as was mentioned, it's not always possible to, use basically economic pressure to make that happen. As a physician, you can choose not to work in a hospital that doesn't offer full access reproductive and other types of healthcare as well. Again, a lot of times physicians are also constrained in terms of geographically where they need to live for family or other reasons. There are efforts in Washington state, as well as I know in other states, to certainly provide protection for physicians who give evidence-based care within Catholic institutions to not then meet repercussions like getting fired, which happens. And at least in Washington state, that's not yet been successful. This type of legislation often takes a number of years to make its way into law. So it's something that continues to get reintroduced with each legislative session. But that could certainly be a way to remove the fear from clinicians for providing what is legal evidence-based care, simply because they work in a Catholic institution and might get reprimanded or fired for that. Sometimes going to the media if you're a patient, or going to a legal advocate if you're a patient and have been refused care, that can be another way to fight back. Again, we're talking about not just healthcare, but really highly sensitive, stigmatized healthcare a lot of times. And so it is not uncommon that patients aren't interested in publicizing their personal business. And so that also is very challenging to find patients who are able and willing to have their stories used by either legal advocates or the media to put pressure on an institution either. So those are some of the ways that I can think of. Again, I'm not sure how effective any of them are. They're all quite challenging.
Thank you. We have another question trickling in. I think we touched on this a little bit, but the question is, the film featured independent abortion women's health clinics. These clinics are often the target of regressive state laws that restrict abortion. With the genesis of the complex family planning specialty, what do physicians on this panel see as the future of independent women's clinics?
Hi, this is Mark again. I can take that, and thanks to my good friend Emily Godfrey for asking that question. Much appreciated. And Sarah can answer this as probably better than I, since she runs the complex family planning specialty training program at University of Washington, but I did that for a long time at OHSU, so have some familiarity. I worry that, well, I should probably provide a little bit of background for some of the attendees. So now there is a subspecialty within OBGYN where physicians get additional training to be expert in family planning. And a lot of that is second trimester or even later abortion care. And in that 2-year fellowship, these folks come out at the end of it really expert at taking care of complicated abortion patients. Andrea talked about the importance of the independent clinics in terms of, having costs be affordable, and because many, as we've talked about, many hospitals or private clinics don't provide abortion care, then so much of the care has fallen to the independents, as well as Planned Parenthood, of course. I've worried for a long time that there will be a legal attack on provision of abortion care along the lines of requiring in various states that abortions only be provided by people who have finished one of these fellowships. I could see that happening in hospitals. I could also see that in some way. I'm sure there are legislators out there plotting some legal strategies to impose laws that would restrict provision of abortion to fellowship trained individuals, which I think is ridiculous, as many of us have talked about. Straightforward abortion is can be done by advanced practice clinicians very effectively. So in terms of the importance of the independent clinics going forward, they are going to very much continue to be a major part, as will Planned Parenthood, in terms of providing abortions across the country. And I'm very worried. From Emily's question, I sense she's concerned about it, as am I, and I would bet that Sarah is as well. But I'll be interested in your thoughts.
Thanks, Mark, and also thanks, Emily, for asking the question. I think the motivation for moving forward with a complex family planning subspecialty is to legitimize in some way the practice of abortion care and complex contraception care. I think over the last 30 years, we've seen it legitimized anyway. I think there's been a huge increase in the recognition of the importance of knowing how to provide this care, not just within obstetrics and gynecology, as I said before, but also within primarily family medicine, but other medical specialties, as well as non-physician clinician groups. I think we are living in a time when any opportunity to restrict access to abortion care, as we've seen so recently with COVID, will be met with attempts to subvert that into a barrier. So I think it really remains to be seen what's going to happen with complex family planning as a subspecialty. My hope is that it can be used to put abortion provision, complex family planning on the same level of other obstetric and gynecologic subspecialties like gynecologic oncology or maternal fetal medicine or reproductive endocrinology and infertility or urogynecology. That would be ideal for it to elevate our subspecialty within the field of obstetrics and gynecology, as well as medicine in general. However, I'm cynical enough to, like Mark Nichols was saying, also fear that it will be used for evil intent. So we'll see. I think those of us within the specialty will certainly be using our powers to fight for good.
Thank you. We have another question for Director Jan Haaken. How can people get involved and stay involved to support this film and also to support the providers?
Well, the film's now available. There's a version for educators through Collective Eye that can be ordered by teachers and institutions, but more broadly, video on demand that makes it available for people to watch at home. I've had mixed feelings about the VOD strategy. I know it's an important measure of success, but for me, what's been most gratifying and will continue to be most gratifying is to watch a film in groups. And that's why I make films, is that the film in a way is something that people even who might disagree or have tensions or conflicts can focus on the film, and it can bring people together instead of a frontal confrontation. And to create a space, a kind of thinking, reflective space for dialogue and deepening understandings of an issue that's anxiety provoking for people. And so I would we'll continue to support campus screenings, community screenings, and you can go on the website, Our Bodies, Our Doctors, to schedule a screening in your community. And we have 2 festival screenings coming up in August in the South. One is Repro Film Festival in Wichita, and they've done quite a bit of outreach on that. And you buy a ticket, kind of like people did with Eventbrite. You buy a ticket, and then there's a panel people participate in later. So there are many ways to continue to support the film, I think, with providers. Part of it is learning how to talk about abortion, and to have, and a number of audiences have said that they have not really had a language or a way of framing even things that they're uneasy about before seeing the film. So we hope that so we'll continue having generating discussion. We know in most social movements, prejudices flourish by marginalizing a group or an activity, keeping it under a cloak of shame or hiddenness. So that's part of the ethos of this project, is to generate more discussion around abortion as part of a larger vision of healthcare, reproductive justice as well. But I'm open to ideas. People, I'm pretty easy to reach. If anyone can, if you have suggestions or questions, do feel free to reach me on that website or on my website as well.
Thank you. Yeah, we have another question coming in posed for the physicians, kind of similar. People wondering what are some of the tools, and if there are any tools that can be implemented to decrease the implications in the structural stigma within the realm of family planning.
I was just thinking, I'm glad that's a really timely question, because when Jan was talking just now, I was thinking about, there's been I think a lot more movement around that in the recent past. And I was thinking about one organization called Shout Your Abortion, which I think has been a really effective group and also creative, its goal is to basically destigmatize women who have abortions, or people who have abortions. And the whole idea behind it is talking openly about one's experience, and they have different events, and they've put out publications. And I went to an event a while ago, pre-COVID, in Portland, that was a fundraiser, and they did a comedy event in a local bar, and they had stand-up comedians, and it was just really it was crowded, a packed event, and it was a really great thing to attend, and just have people sitting around talking about their experience, and hear comedians talking about abortion in a really open way. And it wasn't, I wasn't around the people I work with. I was just around average people talking openly about this. And I think that the more that people do that, then you realize the person next to you is like, oh yeah, well, I had an abortion too. Oh yeah, my mom had an abortion. Because the fact of the matter is that everybody knows someone who's had an abortion. Then there's more of those situations like Dr. Prager references, that's kind of funny, but also very poignant in the film, where she's at the airport and, buying a muffin, and the woman behind the barista says, I know you did my abortion, and in front of all of her, colleagues, and she's not ashamed. And I love that scene, because It's funny, but it's also just, it gives me chills because this woman is completely shameless. And, you know, it's like, oh, you did my root canal. And I think that the more that those kinds of conversations happen in everyday life, that we can get to a point, hopefully as a society, where we acknowledge that this is something that everyone experiences on some level across our entire country, across cultures, across religious beliefs and political beliefs. We just need to talk about it.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. So in the film, Dr. Leo Han also talks about the visual culture of abortion, what he refers to as the black box, and people can fill it in with whatever they want. I don't know if Dr. Oyer, you would like to say more kind of about the repercussions of misinformation. I know in the film you discuss how the stigma around abortion will continue if we also just don't talk about it.
Yeah, I think that speaks to what Andrea just said as well. I think the more we talk about abortion, the less stigmatized it is. And there is that unknown. And the anti-choice folks spend a lot of time talking about what they say happens in an abortion, which has nothing to do with reality. And so I do feel like every time I speak on abortion, it's important to talk about what actually happens in the room. And that's why I think this film is so important, because it actually shows what happens in the room. The vast majority of patients after their abortion, even if they do not have sedation, say, oh, that was nothing like what I was expecting. And of course, what they're expecting is something that is so horrific we couldn't do even if we tried. Because the truth is, when abortion was illegal, bad things happened, but abortions were done by people without training, with unsterile instruments. And nowadays, abortion is very, very safe. It's one of the safest procedures done in the world and in our country. And it takes, in the first trimester, about 2 to 4 minutes. And people do not understand that. So I think if we as providers don't talk about the reality of it, we leave the other side to talk about the unreality of it. And so what people are left with is that it's really dangerous, that it's horrific, that it's incredibly painful, none of which is really true. And I think we owe it to our patients, but also to people in general who are going to need abortions, to understand that medically it's a very simple procedure and a very safe procedure.
I could add to that. I'd like to just say, you know, one thing that was so amazing for me about this documentary and being a part of this documentary is that when it screened at a film festival in Seattle last year, my then 8th grader and a bunch of her friends and their parents all came to watch the film. And to have a big group of, you know, 14-year-olds seeing this, hearing this information, hearing things talked about in a very open way, a very destigmatized way, that was really powerful for me to know that at least they're getting those messages at this one time, and hopefully more broadly than that, because, you know, clearly their parents were comfortable enough bringing them to see the documentary. So, you know, it all goes part and parcel with, you know, Dr. Han mentioned the black box, shine a light and the box goes away, you know. So what Dr. Shivarini and Dr. Oyer have been saying, talk about it and talk about it normally. We often hear people talk about abortion and they lower their voice, or they don't want to say the word so other people can hear them. And we need to talk about abortion and say it in the same tone of voice that we talk about other things. And you know, patients pick up on that too. Our children are going to pick up on that. Our friends are going to pick up on that. If we sound really normal about it, it's going to seem like a normal thing. Hopefully.
Thank
Jan,
you.
you're muted.
Oh, I think I've taught a course, or used to teach a course on film theory. And if you look at the history of representations of women in film, and sexuality and reproduction. For a long time, you did not see people having sex in films. There were strict rules, even married couples in separate beds. There was even the days of confinement. There have been times in history where women who are pregnant did not go out, and you didn't see queer people having sex. So abortion seems like one of those last frontiers in popular culture. And I think that's part of what's been gratifying to many of us who've been part of this movement, to see it enter into our, kind of the visual vocabulary we have as well. And to recognize that this has been a long-standing fight in Hollywood films as well, is the repression of women's bodies, women's lives, and all of its complexity. And sometimes it means women are crying, sometimes it's no big deal. That was also important to acknowledge a range of emotions as you would acknowledge in any event in life that can have different meanings for people.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes if anyone else would like to kind of just take a minute to wrap up your final thoughts on our discussion tonight. And thank you all again so much for taking time to do this evening.
Well, since we have just a couple more minutes, there was one question that I think is touching on medication abortion, which is not something that was really touched all that much on the film, but is becoming increasingly an important part of abortion care. And maybe that will be for the sequel, Jan, so you can start working on that. But it removes the entire scenario from a clinic-based experience like what we've been talking about, and changes that to where the woman has total control of when and where she expels her pregnancy. She can do that in the privacy of her home with her family present. I mean, we could all of the panelists could go on and on and on about that. So it's an important point. And because the question was asked, I just didn't want to go off without addressing it. Yes, it's hugely important, and it's going to become more so. And in the COVID-19 world, it has become increasingly used. So it's a timely question as well. So,
can I add a point about that in terms of the choices for filmmaking? I think the surgical abortion has been attacked more, it's stigmatized more, and it does confront you with a choice that is being made that's different from taking pills for other things. And so I do think it's important to both fight for medical abortion, but also realize that surgical abortion, which has been most exploited in its imagery by the anti-choice movement, needs to be defended. And I think, plus it's more interesting to see in a film than taking, and it involves, the commitment of people being there in the healthcare field with the person as well. It's a commitment on the part of a team of people, but in no way is that meant to downplay the importance of medical abortions, certainly in early terminations. I don't know if others want to chime in on that or not.
So I would like to say, going back to where we started with Jasmine's first question about how COVID has affected people, the one bright light in COVID is that telemedicine for medication abortion has become much more common. And recently, a court decided that because of COVID, the abortion pill no longer has to be dispensed from the practitioner's office or the hospital. And so for the first time, we can legally mail abortion pills to people's homes. And so they can actually stay at home, have a telemedicine appointment, and not have to go anywhere. So it is the one way in which abortion has become more accessible with COVID.
And if this is Sarah, if I could highlight one other question that was asked in the Q&A about what do women getting abortions need as support so they can move on in their lives, I think it's actually really important to address that. And the answer is that we have actually really great research data now that shows that most women actually feel pretty good about their abortions. About 95% of them don't experience regret. And what they need is our support and understanding that they made the best decision for them. Physically, most women feel pretty darn good within a very short period of time. And again, I think our non-judgment is really the most important thing that we can give women in terms of what they need before, during, and after their abortion.
Thank you. I think that's a great note to end on. That brings us to the time we have tonight. And thanks again to the panel for joining us and sharing your thoughts. It was really an honor to get to moderate this and learn about the work that you all do. And thank you to the listeners for joining us in this event. And I hope you all have a really great rest of your evening.
And thank you, Jasmine. Nicely done.
Yeah, thanks, Jasmine and Jan and Sarah and Ryan.
Me